Doings of Doyle is sponsored by Belanger Books, home of the best Sherlock Holmes anthologies featuring today's top Sherlockian authors. Belanger Books is the only authorised publisher of Solar Ponds mysteries, continuing the Sherlock Holmes legacy into the 21st century. Visit them today at belangerbooks.com. Welcome to Doings of Doyle, a podcast dedicated to the works of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Professor Challenger, Brigadier Gerard, and, of course, Sherlock Holmes. I'm Mark Jones.
And I'm Paul Chapman, and together we'll be exploring Doyle's eclectic bibliography to understand more about the great man's life and work. We'll be discussing his fiction and non-fiction, the well-known and the obscure.
And stopping by Baker Street along the way. You can find out more at doingsofdoyle.com or follow us at Doings of Doyle on Twitter. Hello and welcome to episode 31. This time we join an expectant father as he pensively awaits the arrival of his firstborn in The Curse of Eve, one of Conan Doyle's Round the Red Lamp stories from 1894. And here's Paul to introduce the story.
Robert Johnson is a very ordinary man, a gentleman's outfitter by trade. He is happily married to Lucy, who looks after the bills and the books. Change is in the air, however, with the imminent arrival of a baby. When the day comes, Robert goes to fetch the doctor, pre-booked months earlier. But he is out on a call and Robert must find him to attend upon Lucy's confinement. But this task is not as simple as it sounds, and Robert is about to face the most difficult and testing trial of his life.
Now, this story almost owes its creation to Sherlock Holmes, in that it was in the light of the enormous success of The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes in the Strand magazine that Jerome K. Jerome, the editor of The Idler, asked Conan Doyle to write a series of stories for his own magazine. He asked originally for 6 or 8 tales to commence in March 1893, and Conan Doyle quite quickly settled on the idea of a series of medical stories that would draw on his recent history. Now, Conan Doyle originally planned to write the stories in early 1893, but the burden of writing the memoirs of Sherlock Holmes for the Strand pushed that timeline out. We know he started writing The Curse of Eve specifically towards the end of 1893, because on the 8th of December, he read a draft of it to fellow writers at the Authors Club, the social wing of the Society of Authors. Now, one of the attendees at that meeting was Ralph Blumenfeld, a reporter at the Daily Express and indeed later its editor, who recalled this reading in his memoirs. He wrote, "Dr. Conan Doyle rose to read from a news story which he had just completed. It was all about obstetrics and the terror of a household in which a woman was about to become a mother, all about the husband's agonies, the doctor's embarrassments, and professional distress. I'd forget the details, but my mind jumps across to that evening in St. James, with 100 men in evening dress sitting uneasily under the monotonous flow of the Scottish Northumbrian phrases, with not a sign of light, just a long, gloomy, ghastly dissertation, which, if I remember rightly, made me feel unhappy and cold. Finally, the big man with the rough voice stopped talking and sat down abruptly. Walter Besant turned to me and said, 'Have you ever heard worse?' I had not." And Blumenfeld went on in his memoirs to write, "There was nothing in the story or its recital to give it the slightest claim to posterity, and I think the verdict of the audience unanimously was thumbs down. Conan Doyle certainly gained no laurels that night. He'd sensed his failure of the evening and was correspondingly depressed." It certainly sounds like it was a grim evening, because we have a second account of the reading from another attendee, Francis Gribble, the editor of the Phil Mays Annual, and we'll come back to Phil Mays later. And Gribble gave his recollections to Hesketh Pearson for his biography of Conan Doyle, His Life and Art. Gribble told Hesketh Pearson that he'd heard Doyle read The Curse of Eve at the Authors Club before it appeared in Jerome's paper, The Idler, and that in the original version the wife died, and the bereaved father tried to kill the baby, shouting at it, "You little beast, you've murdered your mother." Pearson added his own commentary at this point, saying that Doyle saw life melodramatically like Dickens, his characters being theatrical as those as Dickens, though much less various. But it wasn't all negative. Douglas Sladen, who was the secretary of the Authors Club, was a great supporter of Conan Doyle and wrote a letter to the author to buoy him up. He wrote, "Your story has made a most profound impression. 2 or 3 men have told me that they couldn't sleep after it. I can't personally recall anything in fiction more lifelike than The Husband. He was a masterpiece. Now, the story goes that Conan Doyle was followed by Jerome K. Jerome, who desperately tried to raise the mood of the evening by giving a humorous reading. And while Jerome ultimately accepted The Curse of Eve for the Idler, he wrote to Conan Doyle, "Let us have the others a little less sad. I dread the effect upon the sensitive reader." Now, in fact, in the end, Jerome didn't use The Curse of Eve, finding it a little too strong for public taste, although ironically he did print The Case of Lady Sannox, which we covered in episode 6, probably one of the most shocking short stories that Conan Doyle ever wrote. So all of that took place towards the end of 1893. Early the next year, Conan Doyle began to work on 2 medical volumes. The first was the semi-autobiographical Stark Munro letters, which we mentioned in our conversation with Douglas Kerr last time, and that started to appear in October 1894. And the other was Round the Red Lamp, a collection of the stories which some of which had by then been serialized, and others which had never quite made it into the serial press, like The Curse of Eve. He began revising that content early in 1894 and wrote to his mother in May saying, "I'm busy over my medical book. I shall also modify at least one of those strong stories to make them less painful. I shall make the woman recover in The Curse of Eve." So the story never made it to the Idler, and it was one of several new stories that first appeared in Round the Red Lamp when it was released on the 23rd of October, 1894. And it's worth spending a bit of time now thinking about why Jerome asked for these stories and why it then didn't make it into the pages of the Idler.
Yeah, Jerome K. Jerome had actually asked Doyle to write a set of stories for him in summer 1892. He wanted, as he put it, something very strong to follow my novel notes.
Mm,
The novel notes was an ongoing story that Jerome had been writing about 2 men trying to write a novel together, and then he obviously wanted something a little bit different
mm,
from Doyle. And it's the fact he actually asked for something very strong, and then the stories he got, he found them too strong.
yeah,
And so of the set that Doyle produced, only 4 actually appeared in the Idler, which were Sweethearts, the Los Amigos Fiasco,
mm,
the Doctors of Hoyland, and the Case of Lady Sannox, which
mm.
is, as we discussed in episode 6, a very strong story.
Yes,
Which it is astonishing he rejected some of the medical stories and then put that in.
yeah.
But then it could be because Lady Sannox is a gothic fantasy rather than something that's more real life. And then there were 5 stories went into Round the Red Lamp. His first operation, the third generation, the Curse of Eve, a medical document, and the surgeon talks,
Mm,
which had possibly been heading towards the Idler and never got there.
mm. And some of those are quite strong meat as well. I mean, the third generation famously is a very graphic depiction of well, syphilis in that case. Although the
Mm,
word syphilis is never used.
Yes, there's an assumption of knowledge, I think, on Doyle's part there, or the people will know what he's talking about,
Mm,
and then don't mention it itself, and you'll keep the morality police away from you.
mm. And the subject of sort of probity, what is acceptable, is might be what lies behind that whole reaction from Conan Doyle's fellow authors at the Authors Club that evening in December 1893.
Yes, absolutely, and you've got to bear in mind that this club was men only.
Mm,
So this is a very male grouping, and I think the subject itself, a story based around childbirth, is
mm,
seen as not quite tasteful subject for fiction or literature.
mm.
So that in itself would have made a lot of members that night feel uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And then the fact that it had this very dark and downbeat ending
Mm,
would just add to the whole thing. I mean, you really get that from Blumenfeld's account. You can
mm,
sense, although he's writing this years later, you can sense that night made an impact, and you feel this unease that was obviously in the air, and almost the kind of feeling that Doyle had misjudged the evening very badly,
Yeah.
and read the wrong sort of story for that sort of gathering. Another point of particular interest, which makes this story very, very pertinent to the time that Doyle wrote and read it out, is that he had become a father twice over,
Mm,
very recently. So his daughter Mary had been born on the 28th of January 1889, and Doyle actually delivered his own daughter at home on that
mm,
occasion. And then on the 15th of November 1892, his son Kingsley had been born. I'm not sure whether Doyle himself delivered Kingsley or
mm.
not. But nevertheless, when he's writing here about the anxieties of the expectant father,
Yes.
he's been through it. So
Yes.
he's seen it from both sides. He's seen it from the expectant father's point of view, and also obviously from the side of the medical man actually delivering the child.
Yes. Yeah, it would be written around the time of Kingsley's first
Mm,
birthday.
mm. And it's also of note, I think, on that sort of theme, where you've got the kind of social history almost side of this story, where it is very notable that the only men allowed in on the birth are the
Mm,
doctors. Otherwise, it's women in attendance.
yes.
And Robert is very firmly kept out of the delivery room.
And this realism was very much in vogue at the time.
Yes, there's a great debate going on at the time. We must remember that this sort of period, you're getting the Russian writers, Dostoevsky, Turgenev, are becoming
Mm,
very popular amongst in translation with British readers. Zola, Emile Zola.
mm,
Awful lot of controversy about Zola's work. The publisher Frank Viztelli goes to prison for publishing translations of Zola's work, and one particular work that Conan Doyle was interested in was Esther Waters
mm,
by George Moore, which is a story of a housemaid made pregnant. And her struggles, and there's also gambling involved in this novel, which Doyle thought that Moore's whole treatment of this was the right way to approach. It wasn't sensationalizing,
no.
but nevertheless, W.H. Smith, who had the monopoly essentially on railway book trade, decided they weren't going to allow it on their shelves.
Mm,
Doyle was extremely annoyed about this, and essentially, when did the bookseller become the censor? And went very public on his support for Moore. He wasn't backed up by all of his contemporaries by any means, but the debate was out there in the open, and it was a very scathing debate at the
mm,
time, and people wondering where is literature going. Because the other thing you've also got to remember is this was the time when Oscar Wilde and the aesthetes and the
mm,
decadents were also publishing. So the literature was going through a real major phase of public, yeah, fear in some ways, doubt,
mm.
and what is good literature, what is good fiction, what is the right subject for fiction. And it's very interesting with Doyle because we still to this day look at him as this kind of writer of manly adventure fiction, and there's so much more, and his defense of Moore stands up for that, and the controversy around these medical stories, including the Curse of Eve.
Yeah, and it's interesting you mentioned Zola in that as well. I mean, Zola spoke at the Authors Club in September 1893, where he was heralded as the evangelist of realism. That's
Mm,
only, a couple of months before Conan Doyle stands up and gives his realist story,
mm,
and gets a very, very different kind of reaction. So maybe it was something that was okay for foreigners and not necessarily for,
mm,
for the British public. But I mean, Conan Doyle definitely realized he was treading a fine line, and you get that sense in the preface to Round the Red Lamp. He's sort of making the point that this realistic depiction of medical life is a kind of unvarnished truth, and that there are learning points for the reader. So he says, a tale which may startle the reader out of his usual grooves of thought and shock him into seriousness plays the part of the alterative and tonic in medicine, bitter to the taste but bracing in its result. And he when he wrote to James Payn the following year when he was revising Curse of Eve and other stories for inclusion in that volume, He readily recognized that the stories might be too realistic for some people, and noted that the practical details of a doctor's life do take a somber shape, but also thought that he would lose friends over it. Almost certainly remembering that evening on the 8th of December when he got a very grim reaction. And the debate that you're talking about around Esther Walters and others carries through into the reviews of Round the Red Lamp. One of the reviews from Harper's Weekly, which of course at this time had already published memoirs of Sherlock Holmes, they were about to publish The Parasite in serialized form. Despite having Conan Doyle as one of their sort of regular star authors, was very quick to criticize. And picking up on Conan Doyle's point about an alterative and a tonic in the preface, they wrote, "The bitterness to the taste is evident, and with all due respect to the doctor, the patient will get more lasting benefit out of the prescriptions called Sweethearts and the Straggler of 15, which act as sedatives," not the best description of them, than out of all the bitter tonics contained in the third generation or the Curse of Eve, which shock us into a state of seriousness far less bracing than bitter. The London Evening Standard said this sort of thing would all be very well in the column of a medical journal or told to a party of professional men with a taste for such details, but it is, we contend, unfit for publication in a work of fiction meant for the general public. And The Writer, a monthly magazine for literary workers, said that any objector to morbid realism would have left The Curse of Eve out of Round the Red Lamp, although they reserved their particular criticism for the case of Lady Sannox. The Speaker, finally, the Speaker posed exactly that question that you were talking about. Ought the tragical realities and painful commonplaces of the sick room and the deathbed to be made the theme of fiction?
You have to think about this as well. What Doyle thought he was doing here,
Hmm.
whether he was deliberately reading a story that he knew his audience would there would be very mixed reaction, to say the best,
Hmm.
or there are times when you think Doyle's social antenna weren't finely tuned. And
Hmm.
he just thought it was such a great story himself. He didn't actually think about the audience's reaction
Hmm.
to the story. It's like a person who tells a tasteless joke in the wrong
Yeah, in the wrong context.
company.
Hmm.
I just can't work it out. But whatever, it certainly backfired on him, and you can, again, from those accounts that you've been reading, you can really sense this idea of Jerome K. Jerome scrabbling about to try and save the evening and turn it back
Yes.
into a jolly matey meeting of male writers.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting as well, that this sort of the possible reaction to finding the just the subject itself, the subject of childbirth, distasteful for a
Hmm.
story. I mean, we're talking about a group of men here in the early 1890s. But in 1977, Ronald Pearsall, in his biography of Conan Doyle, when he's talking about the Curse of Eve, says, "The Curse of Eve was too strong for Jerome K. Jerome, the editor of the Idler, and Doyle was obliged to tone it down. Another writer would have realized the repulsiveness of the theme and hastily destroyed the manuscript, but not Doyle. The repulsiveness of the theme."
Hmm.
This is doubtless how a lot of those men felt at the Authors Club gathering.
Hmm.
And the other thing I think about this time in Doyle's life is he's really just moving from his previous profession of doctor into becoming a professional full-time writer in a very serious way. And I just wonder if at this point he's musing upon his previous profession, because we've got Round the Red Lamp and then the Stark Munro letters all coming up. So it's contextualizing his life at that point, where he is and where he's been. And perhaps he's just very focused on his own thoughts and just again not thinking
Yes.
about how other people are going to be taking this.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment. And also, I think if he was looking at this from the point of view of, you know, let me write something in this new realist tradition. I mean, he, much more comfortable in the realm of romantic fiction
Mm, mm,
than realist in many ways. He has the perfect opportunity there, being both a writer and a doctor. He can bring
mm,
in this reveals something of this very private profession, a profession that is at this time professionalizing, and
Mm.
they're finding their place as a respectable trade. Round the Red Lamp doesn't really get many reviews in the Lancet.
Mhm.
One of the reviews in the Lancet is actually by Sir Malcolm Morris, who accompanied Conan Doyle to Vienna to see the experiments of Robert Koch on tuberculosis. And it was Morris who convinced Conan Doyle to give up his South Sea practice and to become a specialist. And it's to Morris that the Doings of Raffles Haw, which we discussed in episode 1, that novel is dedicated to Morris. So again, it's right on the cusp, isn't it, of him
Mm.
moving from one life to the other. And I think he does sort of step over some professional boundaries as a former medic in this
Mm.
story and in other stories. But what I think is quite fascinating about it is that um, in the rest of Round the Red Lamp, he tends to have a very black and white view. GPs tend to be good, surgeons tend to be
Mm.
bad. And in this, you don't quite get the same thing. This whole story is much more shades of grey, which kind of goes with it being a realist short story. He's trying to
Mm.
reflect reality in its broadest sense. And so you have Dr. Miles, who's a GP, but he's very aloof. He's beyond the ordinary man. He seems overconfident. He annoys Johnson by asking questions about rent and being apparently distracted. But then Johnson is chided by the narrator at one point because Johnson takes issue with the fact that Dr. Miles has to have his dinner
Mm.
before he comes out and sees his wife. And the narrator basically points out that Johnson had no conception of medical men having to look after themselves before they
Mm.
went out. Similarly, you have the specialist Pritchard, who is described as being gruff and has put money before philanthropy. But then again, he's described as a man with a kindly heart.
Mm.
So you don't get these complete black and white depictions as you get elsewhere. This is not Douglas Stone in Lady Sannox, who is,
Mm.
slam dunk villain of the piece,
Mm.
proper melodrama piece. And this is perhaps why this story gets such a visceral reaction, is that it actually feels very real in the way
Mm.
that it depicts those characters.
And you do have to wonder as well where Doyle names the consultant Dr. Pritchard,
Mm.
whether he's having a little joke at the expense of his former profession. Because the most famous Dr. Pritchard at that time was the infamous Glasgow poisoner, Dr. Edward William Pritchard, who was hanged in 1865 for poisoning his wife and mother-in-law. And we know that Doyle was very familiar with Pritchard's nefarious career because in The Speckled Band, Sherlock Holmes says to Dr. Watson, "When a doctor does go wrong, he is the first of criminals. He has nerve and he has knowledge. Palmer and Pritchard were among the heads of their profession." And you have to wonder which profession Holmes is talking about. Is it either medicine or murder?
True. But there's another aspect to this in that there's a sort of tacit criticism of the way that the medical profession is structured and funded. That Johnson, as a hardworking tailor, and we get right in that first paragraph,
Mm.
the trials and tribulations of him and his wife trying to make ends meet. Johnson has to pay in advance for Dr. Miles, who then isn't available when he needs him. And then Dr. Miles has to bring in this consultant who requires 3 guineas,
Mm.
payable at the time, it says, to look after his wife, who, as far as he's concerned, could well be on her deathbed. And, there is a sort of tacit criticism within there of that system. Otherwise, you wouldn't get quite so much setup of Johnson being, not so well off. The whole story is also set in a area of London, the sort of border of Shoreditch and Islington, this area, the New North Road, but not an affluent area by any stretch of the imagination. So I think Conan Doyle's making a bit of a point here. And it did remind me a bit of, I've written about this elsewhere, but the connection between Conan Doyle's work and the work of another great doctor turned writer, A.J. Cronin,
Mm.
who wrote The Citadel in 1937, the book that many people believe inspired the NHS because it was a searing indictment of the profession at the time and held up as an alternative the example of a miners'
mm,
society in Wales that had clubbed together and were essentially buying their own medical care for everyone. And Conan Doyle and Cronin, in many ways, live parallel lives, both being Scots, both being Anglo-Irish descent, both being doctors, both having served as ship surgeons before going into practice, both having a difficult time in practice,
mm.
both turning away from that in favor of writing. The contexts of their medical lives are very different, but actually many of the issues that Conan Doyle sort of tacitly criticizes here and in other stories in Round the Red Lamp would be exactly the same ones that would come up in The Citadel in 1937.
And it's interesting in that context. I think one of the major figures in the both the Society of Authors and the Authors Club, will be coming into the background of those shortly, was Walter Besant,
Yeah.
and he'd written this sprawling novel in 1882, All Sorts and Conditions of Men,
Mm,
which was shouting about the conditions in the East End, and it actually raised public awareness at that time, and was seen as being responsible for the establishment of the People's Palace on the Mile End Road.
mm,
So Besant was also involved in this sort of use of literature to make social points. So you would think he would have understood, what Conan Doyle was trying to do with this work.
yes.
And the other thing within this sort of context that interests me about this particular night at the Authors Club, and the reminiscences of it, is you wonder how many of them were listening to the story,
Yeah.
or if it's just once they got fixed in their heads what it was about, that they kind of didn't listen to the actual story itself. It's again, Blumenfeld talks about, it's almost like he's zoning out when he talks about Conan Doyle's, monotonous Scots Northumbrian accent.
Yes.
It's like he's become so uh, obsessed with the theme of the story that he's not listening to what Doyle is actually saying, and that how many of these people are that, where is this story going? But they're also not following in many ways the fact that in some ways Conan Doyle's using an adventure story structure with twists and turns
Mm,
and irony
mm.
throughout it. So it is well structured, and I just think on that night there's a number of the listeners probably missed a lot of the story's subtlety.
Yeah, and it's very hard, of course, to understand quite how warranted the reaction was because we don't have the original ending. We don't know
Mm, mm.
what it was like now, but there might be some clues within the story itself to how the Curse of Eve originally turned out. Because I don't know about you, but I don't feel like the ending of the Curse of Eve really works as well as the ending as it might have originally been intended.
It's one that's if we read the original ending from what's said, that we know from that the mother dies and the father blames the child.
Mm,
It would be almost unbearable to read that.
yeah.
In the version we've got, there is this sense of relief. I know it seems a cop out almost, but oh, good.
Yes. Well, this is right. I mean, I think that's where I think the problem with the ending that we get is that it doesn't quite have the kind of clear through line as you might get from the ending as it's described by Blumenfeldt and Gribble. So
Mm,
Conan Doyle seems to have a bit of a dilemma as to what the story is fundamentally about. At one level, it seems to be a man's profound change of character that comes upon him as when he becomes a father.
mm,
And there's a line there. He seemed to be making a new start in life. He felt that he was a stronger and a deeper man. Perhaps all this suffering had an object then. It might prove to be a blessing both to his wife and to him. The very thought was one which he would have been incapable of conceiving 12 hours before. He was full of new emotions. If there had been a harrowing, there had been a planting too. But Conan Doyle then almost immediately undercuts that with the sentence, but he felt a resentment to the little red blinking creature. He could not forgive it yet for that long night of misery. So it doesn't sort of feel that the story works as a kind of epiphany, moment of epiphany
mm,
for Johnson. But I think if you take the other themes, the idea that actually you have Johnson who's put in this position of huge anxiety, you can imagine how the ending, if it had been as Gribble described,
Mm.
would have been incredibly bleak, but kind of more satisfying in a way. Sort of,
Mm-mm.
and in fact, I think there is a clue to that in the very last sentence. London was waking up. The row began to rise from the street. Lives had come and lives had gone, but the great machine was still working out its dim and tragic destiny. Now, that thing about the great machine still working out its dim and tragic destiny speaks to me of the original version of the Curse of
Mm.
Eve, not to the version that we actually get.
I do think it does work though in the sense of the lives have come, lives have gone, in that it contextualizes this little story into the wider, you know, metropolis, as it were, and that night some other expectant mothers might not have been as lucky as Lucy.
Yes, that's a
And then
fair
there's
point.
there's there's the other tragedies of life and other tragedies of life and death going on all around. How many people have died in London that night of various causes? And I
Mm.
I quite like that contextualization
Yes,
that brings in.
and that sort of fits a bit more with it. It's a vignette, and there would be
Mm.
many hundreds of similar vignettes taking place at any point in time
Mhm.
on any similar evening, as you say. And it's worth spending a bit of time now, I think, on the Authors Club because it's so important to this story, but also Conan Doyle's life more broadly. The Society of Authors was founded by Walter Besant in 1884, and it was largely an organization to support authors' rights. And in 1891, it held a special dinner to celebrate the passing of the US Copyright Act, something that was very special to Conan Doyle's interests. He'd lobbied very hard on getting copyright protections for authors, and it was a real galaxy of stars attending the dinner. You had people like Oscar Wilde, Rider Haggard, Walter Besant. Conan Doyle's great childhood hero, Bret Harte, was at that meeting, and Conan Doyle himself. A week later, Besant and a few others met to organise the Authors Club, ostensibly as a kind of social wing of the Society of Authors. And Besant had tried something similar back in 1880. It was called the Rabelais Club, and that had included Thomas Hardy, Henry James, Robert Louis Stevenson, but it all fizzled by the end of the 1880s. Um, and he might well have been thinking back to an example in the USA. The Authors Club in New York had been founded in 1882 with members including Mark Twain, Theodore Roosevelt, Andrew Carnegie. There were two big questions on the formation of the Authors Club. Was it going to admit women? And would it be a social club or would it be more of a kind of meeting place for authors to conduct business? On the first point, Besant was obviously very keen on it, admitting women. He was the brother in law of the feminist activist Annie Besant. But in the end, he canvassed members for their preference. And they actually preferred a club over a what was called an author's house, a meeting place, and they applied the caveat that it should also be male only. So they decided both questions simultaneously. So it was set up as a male only club, and was remained so long after Besant's death. The women writers went off and set up their own writers' club in September 1891. The Authors Club itself, the rules were adopted in November 1891, and it moved to temporary residence in St James Place in May 1892. But its first dinner wasn't until June 1892, which is a particularly famous meeting because of an outburst by one of the attendees.
Yes, that attendee being Oscar Wilde himself, where he just found out that the Lord Chamberlain had refused a performance license for his play Salome.
Mm,
And he was quite rightly up in arms about this and read a speech to the Authors Club, which was full of his grievances, which a lot of the authors present would obviously sympathise with.
mm,
I mean, the reason Salome was refused its license was a 17th century law which disallowed biblical characters and scenes to be portrayed on the stage.
mm,
And this had just been used as a weapon against Wilde, and he read out a list of all the ironies and idiosyncrasies of this, which kind of fits in with what we were saying about the Curse of Eve. What is permissible and what is not permissible,
Absolutely.
to art, and this particular evening has obviously gone down in literary history.
Mm. And many of the people who attended that meeting, and indeed future meetings, are the great stars of the 1890s. I mean, and people that we've met here before. Cutcliffe Hine, who we
Mm,
mentioned in the Terror Blue John Gap, was an occasional attendee. Kipling. Um,
mm.
Gissing attended once, although he dismissed the attendees as being respectable tradesmen. Um, you've got Hornung, of course, who married Conan Doyle's sister Connie in September 1893. Zangwill, Hardy, Rider Haggard, etc. I mentioned earlier Francis Gribble, who was the editor of Phil May's Annual, and we actually touched on that in the episode on Jellen's Voyage. We couldn't at that time really place the connection between Conan Doyle and Phil May's Annual. We suspected that Phil May was part of this coterie of notables in the 1890s, but we now know that Francis Gribble was an attendee of meetings with Conan Doyle at the Authors Club about 6 months before Jellen's Voyage came out in that annual.
And this probably shows up another aspect of both the Society of Authors and the Authors Club, connections,
Mm,
and stimulating and getting work.
mm.
It's a kind of social networking organisation, and it's interesting to look at the members to see this crossover where you
Yeah.
have got Conan Doyle and Oscar Wilde,
Yes.
um, and later on, Wilde interestingly kept up his connections with the club even after his release from prison,
Yes.
because there is an extant letter that he wrote to his friend Robert Sherrard,
Mm.
who was pretty loyal to Wilde, but every now and again, he he he, he had his occasional doubts, and Wilde wrote a letter to him, rather scathing, in 1897. Saying to Robert Sherrard, "When you wish to talk morality, always an amusement, and to attack me behind my back, don't, like a good fellow, talk so loud as the reverberation reaches from the Authors Club to Naples," where Wilde was
Of course.
in exile at that time.
Mm.
And Sherrard himself was an interesting character because he was a crossover between the aesthetes and he was a jobbing journalist
Mm.
as well.
Mm.
And he actually, with his connection to the aesthetes, the archetypal decadent poet Ernest Dowson actually died in Sherard's house in 1900. But on the other side of Sherard's work, his journalistic work, he was a regular contributor to the Idler.
Yeah, of course.
Mm.
And just as Oscar Wilde had this long connection with the Authors Club, so too did Conan Doyle, and we get frequent references to his connection to the club. The meeting of July 1896 was one where the famous incident where Conan Doyle was asked why he killed off Sherlock Holmes, and was forced to defend his decision, and he uttered the immortal phrase, "I hold that it was not murder, but justifiable homicide in self-defense, since if I had not killed him, he would certainly have killed me." But a few years later, Conan Doyle became the chairman of the Authors Club. Ironically, because of Blumenfeld, the chap who gave the negative review of that reading. Blumenfeld had complained about the operations of the club, and particularly Besant and Crawford's running of the establishment, and they resigned, and Conan Doyle was elected the next chairman. Actually, there's a fascinating history of the Authors Club where a lot of this information comes from, by Schuller, and they point out that the club actually didn't do all that well under Conan Doyle. In fact, the phrase is by 1905, the club was sort of drifting towards the rocks, and I think the reason for that is that Conan Doyle was so busy with other things. He went out to South Africa in that period of time, as well as picking up various public campaigns like Crime of the Congos around this time as well. But also Douglas Sladen, the secretary, was backwards and forwards to Japan, and so there was a lot of criticism of this. And in fact, in 1908, the club was wound down, and then they very quickly had to reinvigorate it because they realized that they wanted to keep the copyright of the name the Authors Club, and actually they couldn't. So ironically, copyright became an issue again. But he carried on with the club. March 1909, he gave the speech, the principal speech at a dinner in honor of the centenary of the birth of Edgar Allan Poe. His speech there is a fascinating one, just revealing how much he owes to Poe in a whole range of different ways. And he was still active in the club into the 1920s. In 1924, Conan Doyle won the billiards tournament for the fourth time. And actually, when he died, he left money and a portable wireless set, somewhat bizarrely, to the Authors Club. Although the Authors Club, who were then located in Whitehall Place, which is right next door to the National Liberal Club, where the Sherlock Holmes Society of London hold their meetings. They discovered that actually the wireless reception was so poor in the building that they decided to spend the money on books instead, which is probably very fitting. But Conan Doyle became one of the great figures of the Authors Club, despite this slightly checkered history as its chairman. And Douglas Sladen, writing in his memoir, 20 Years of My Life in 1914, wrote in incredibly glowing terms about Conan Doyle. And you really get a sense of Conan Doyle's place among the authors of the period. So Sladen wrote, from an early stage in his literary career, Conan Doyle enjoyed the admiration and the deepest respect of all his fellows in the craft, and for years past has undoubtedly been morally the head of the profession. He is not only among the handful who may be called the very best authors of the day, he is the man to whom the profession would undoubtedly look for a lead in any crisis. And he went on to say, the profession as an army would range themselves under his banner. I'm sure Conan Doyle would have absolutely loved that phrase. Suppose a question like the insurance question, which has been threatening the livelihood of thousands of doctors, were to arise for authors. They would look to Doyle for a lead. If the decision which he made benefited authors as a whole, but cost him half or three-quarters of his income, and a syndicate approached him with a huge offer to abandon the camp, nobody could suppose for one moment that Doyle would listen to them. His moral courage, his loyalty, his generosity, his patriotism, added to his wonderful literary gifts, have conferred upon him a commanding position. Of all the authors of the day, he merits most the title of a great man, which is quite an astonishing statement, really. So no wonder when Conan Doyle died, they put up a plaque to him as well in a couple of years later in 1932.
Yes, it's fitting in many ways as well, Mark. You mentioned Douglas Sladen because he's another connection that we hadn't quite realised when we did the Jelland's Voyage episode with his Japanese links. And he actually, wrote on Japan and produced a book in 1892, which had opened with a chapter on Yokohama, where Jelland's Voyage is set, of course. And Conan Doyle may well have read that before writing his story. So it's not just the Willie Burton connection which we went into, but the Sladen, or the possible Sladen connection as well.
Yeah, very good. So that's all we've got time for this episode. If you'd like to read the show notes, you can find them at doingsofdoyle.com. And if you're enjoying the podcast, please leave us a rating or review, or consider sponsoring us at patreon.com/doingsofdoyle. So, Paul, what have we got on the podcast next time?
And next time we have a story which involves medicine again, but also mixes it up with the world of boxing, the Croxley Master.
Excellent. One of my favourites. So I very much look forward to that. So until then, it's goodbye from me.
And goodbye from me.
Goodbye. There we go. Excellent.
Can I just redo my Croxley Master bit?
Of course you can, yeah.
Because I read it out like somebody whose English is a second language.